excited about today's session because it's the first one that we've done that's geared totally towards the beginner. And in our view, the greatest mission that we could have is to help a beginner truly understand what finance is all about. And that's exactly what we're all about, empowering members through understanding of finance. So really looking forward to today's session. Before we get started, I wanted to cover a few administrative items. So the first is we are going to be doing this session on a 2-weekly cadence. So the next session will not be next weekend, but the weekend after that. And similarly for our intermediate to advanced sessions that we're also conducting, they will also be on a 2-week cadence on the other weekend. So, today, this weekend being the exception. This weekend we're doing one video today and one video tomorrow. But from here on out, it'll be one alternating between beginner and intermediate. So great. For those that are new to Barossa Club, I want to start a little bit about what we're all about, and then we can dive into the topic of today, which is personal finance, going from mystery to mastery. And this is part 1. So what are we trying to do here at Barossa Club? So first of all, Barossa Club was founded by a bunch of us that had financial service experience throughout our career. So we went from knowing nothing about finance to knowing quite a bit about finance. And we saw the process of learning it and then practicing it and now trying to teach it. And what we've realized is that we're not surprised that it's such a mystery to so many people. It's explained really, really badly. And what we're trying to do is to make it very understandable and easy to learn, because we're of the opinion that actually it is remarkably easy to understand what's going on. And we hope you walk away from today's presentation with a sense that, hey, that was way too easy, and I totally get it. And if we've done that, I think that'll be a great victory for us. So, so let's review the typical path that we think people go through in finance. So we've listed it out here. So we think that typically people try to learn a little bit about finance and it reads like Greek to them. They can't understand a word of it. And again, we're not surprised why. There is so much jargon and it's so hard to understand intuitively what that means, right? So this leads to confusion, and that confusion leads to frustration, which eventually results in the person saying, you know what, I'm going to go find an advisor and I'm going to get them to deal with all of my financial issues. Now, what are the consequences of that approach? One is the person has given up control of their finances to somebody else. And that, even if the advisor has the best of intentions, which most advisors do, right? Even if they have the best of intentions, because they are not the person themselves, they don't know all the unique things about that person to do the truly right thing for that person. So you're essentially at the mercy of someone else. So what are we trying to do? Barossa is trying to step in and say, you know what, keep using your advisor, but understand finance first. And when you have that baseline of understanding, instead of confusion, you're going to be filled with confidence. And you're going to go back to that same advisor and you're going to be armed with the ability to not only understand what he's saying to you or she's saying to you, but also asking questions, catching mistakes, and figuring out the best course for your life. And so what are the consequences of this? We think that you'll walk away with power, better outcomes, and you'll be collaborating with your advisor to do what is right for you and your family. So that's really the end goal of Barossa. We're trying to get people to the point where they feel empowered and they make better decisions as a result of that in their financial realm. So, okay. So before we get started on, digging into, the tools of personal finance, we should all just step back and say, why do we care about personal finance? What is the end goal of it, and why do I even need to think about it, right? So what we've done here is illustrated the various stages in somebody's life, right? In financial life. First, they get a job. They earn a pretty low salary, their expenses are low, and they're trying to build their career. Then they raise a family, they start advancing in their career, the salary becomes higher, the expenses also become higher, and they raise their family. Eventually, you reach a point where you uh, want to pursue your passions. And as a result, you retire and your salary goes away and your expenses reduce a little bit and you're free to pursue all your dreams and hopes and desires, right? And what personal finance tries to deal with is how do we go from step one to step three? And personal finance is answering that question. So everything we talk about in this series is going to be viewed at of the lens of how does this help you get to this state of financial independence. So let's understand what this means a little bit more. So what does financial independence actually mean? So it means that you don't need to be dependent on earning a salary anymore, right? So most of us, we work and we use that salary to fund our expenses. But financial independence means you don't need a salary to fund your expenses anymore. So how can that be? How does that happen, right? So the key results from the equation that we're showing on this page, the relationship that we're showing on this page. So on the one hand, on the left side, we're showing your savings over time. On the right side, we're showing your expenses. So these grow, but your expenses stay roughly the same. Just because you earn more doesn't mean you automatically move to a bigger house, right? You may do it occasionally, but your expenses tend to grow much slower than your savings. So as a result, there's a certain point when your savings grow big enough that the income that you're able to generate from investing your savings matches your expenses. So what does this mean? That means that you can cover your expenses without earning a salary. And that's what we mean by financial independence. Suddenly, your salary becomes totally optional. You don't need it to fund your lifestyle. And you can preserve your savings all while funding your expenses. So that's really what we're talking about when we're saying financial independence. And we're going to deal in this course with how do you achieve a state of financial independence as quickly as you can using the tools at your disposal, right? But still enjoying life. So I want to talk a little bit about some myth busting as it relates to financial independence. So the first is financial independence is not equal to retirement. So you can choose to retire when you're financially independent, but it's an option. So there are many people who are financially independent who are still lead very, very active lives and still work because they enjoy working, but it becomes purely optional and at your discretion. It also allows you to take more risks. If you don't need to work for a salary and your dreams always have been to be a singer, you can go and pursue that passion. If you wanted to really teach, a foreign language, you can do that, right? Once you've achieved financial independence, you can do it for free, right? So it opens up many doors in your life. So you shouldn't equate financial independence with hanging up your boots and saying, I'm done working, right? That you can choose to do that, or you can choose to be very active and still, have a vibrant professional career. The next myth that a lot of people have is financial independence can only happen in your 60s or later. And that's not true at all. A lot of people are now finding financial independence in their 40s. In fact, there's a growing movement called the FIRE movement, which stands for Financial Independence and Retiring Early. If you Google it, you'll see lots of literature. And this is about millennials. So people younger than me, right, who are leading their lives trying to achieve financial independence early. So it's very much obtainable for you early in life if you lead your life well and make the right decisions with regards to your personal finances. The third myth that a lot of people have is it's all about how much money you make. So while the amount of money you make definitely plays a part in your personal finances and an important part in your personal finances, much more important is how everything works together. How much you earn, how much you save, what you do with those savings, how you protect your assets, and as a result, what does your entire life picture look like? And that's really going to be the determinant of when you can retire and all be financially independent. So if you want more proof on this topic, there's a book I really recommend you guys read. It's called The Millionaire Next Door. So this was a study done by an author who basically said, let me look at a bunch of millionaires in the United States. And what he did is he looked at what did they do, how much did they earn, how did they live their lives. And what he found was the common thread between all of them was not how much they earned, but on their personal finance habits. So that's a great book if you're looking to delve deeper into the subject. So what are we going to explore in this course together? So there are 4 pillars to personal finance mastery, and we're going to look at each of these at one at a time, and we're going to figure out what does this actually mean? How do I do it well? What are the traps? And how do I make sure that I don't fall for these traps, right? So what are the pillars? So the first is savings. You can think of savings like the raw material of your financial health. This is the amount of money that you're putting away for the future, right? So if you think about retirement or financial independence as a garden, right? These are the seeds you're planting, right? Investment is what you do with those savings, right? Or what are you doing with all the money you've tucked away? So you can think of this as the water you're sprinkling on these seeds. That's the thing that's going to get them to grow and flourish. Borrowing. So borrowing is a powerful tool to increase your investments in yourself and earn even more money, right? So borrowing can be thought of as buying more seeds, right, to plant, right? And then you have protection, which is to shield you from the unexpected. Maybe you stockpile a bit of water and fertilizer just in case something goes wrong in your garden, right? Maybe you have some pesticides in case you catch some, fungal growth or insects on your garden, right? So protection is all about shielding your assets going forward and making sure that your assets will survive, unexpected events like illness, etc. So once you've got these 4 pillars, you will have the foundation you need to master personal finance. And the reality is, you're going to find these sessions very simple, but just doing these simple things correctly will put you ahead of the vast majority of people. Again, I've worked in finance my whole career, and I've seen people working in finance making mistakes on their personal finances that you would not believe. And so just mastering these topics, you'll be way ahead of the game. Don't worry about complicated things like investing in individual stocks and, all kinds of complex schemes that people are putting in your head. Just doing this stuff right, you'll be set on a very good path to learn more when you're ready, right? And we'll also have content on that as you graduate to the intermediate level. So, okay. So let's start with savings. Savings is going to be the first pillar that we explore together. So as we discussed, savings is the raw material of your financial well-being. It's what you're putting away for the future. And it's a very simple equation, right? Savings is simply the difference between what you make and what you spend in each period. And why is it important? So, growing your savings is the fundamental requirement for becoming financially independent. Remember in that chart, we saw how the savings grew over time, but the expenses stayed relatively flat. That growth in savings is going to determine when you become financially independent. So, the more you save, the faster you save, the better your chance of becoming financially independent quicker and sooner. The next very important factor of savings is it provides a cushion in case something goes wrong. What if you lose your job? What if you get stuck with a medical illness, right? And you don't have insurance, right? These are unexpected events that happen, and your savings can be used to protect you from really running into dire consequences. So savings also de-risks us. And the more savings you have, the more confident you're going to be in investing in riskier areas, which will allow you to get a higher return on your investment. So if I have, lots and lots of savings, I'm fine taking a little bit of those savings and putting them into risky investments that may work really big, or they may actually, I may lose money on them, right? But if I have very little in savings, I can't take those risks. So it gets you more flexibility in what you do in your financial health going forward. And the last thing is, starting early with savings gives you a huge advantage down the line. And we'll touch on why in the next session, but trust us for now that the earlier you do this, the better your financial health will be down the line. Okay, so how do we optimize our savings? So again, the equation was very simple: income minus expenditures, right? So we know if we save more, it either has to come from earning more or spending less, right? So let's think about these two. Which one is easier to control, right? So can you just walk into your boss's office and say, I want to raise? You can't, right? For the most part. So it's very difficult in the short run to change your income, right? You don't have direct control over it in the short run. In the long term, you can do lots of things. You can invest in yourself, learn lots of skills, do well in your job, so you get promoted, etc., which will pay off in the long term. But in the short term, what we really care about is your expenditures, right? Because it's easier to control and it's based on your day-to-day decisions. So the best way to make short-term changes in your savings rate is to focus on your expenses. And we'll also talk about the income side later. When we talk about borrowing, we'll also talk about how you can improve your income generation in the longer run. And that'll be a topic we discuss later. But for now, we're going to focus on expenses and how do you get those under control. Okay, so getting a handle on expenses, the first step is you have to measure them. Most of us probably don't have a very good idea of how much we're spending this month versus last month or the month before. And we tend to get, caught up in life. There's a lot of things to do in life, and, measuring your expenses doesn't seem like a great use of time, but actually it's a really, really good use of time. And with a little bit of investment of time, you can get great rewards later as you start to manage your personal finances. So we recommend that everybody do this every month. Take a little bit of time and actually map out your expenses. Just the process of doing it will help you save more. As you're listing out your expenses, you're going to say, wow, I didn't know I spent that much on, eating out. Maybe I'm going to try eating out less in the future. It'll give you ideas of how you can save more and more down the line. And the last thing I want to discuss is, while there are tools that automate this, I would recommend for beginners, do it manually first. Actually do it, open up a spreadsheet and do the budget yourself, because the act of creating that is going to be valuable to you, because you're going to really understand your expenses versus just doing some automated thing that looks at your SMSs and gives you one number, right? Once you've done that, then we think there are great tools available to make it more time efficient for you, like Walnut for Android users is a very powerful tool which you can use to look at your expenses in a very quick way. But for beginners, just take the time to do it yourself. It'll pay dividends later. So let's take an example of a spreadsheet format that we would recommend, right? That for our members. So I've just done a dummy spreadsheet here, and I just want to walk through it a little bit with you guys. So first of all, we're going to do it every month, right? So we're going to have, here I've taken 3 months. So Jan, Feb, and March as just dummy numbers. And each month you'll just add another month to this, right? And what we're doing here is we're looking at how much came into our household. So that's the monthly income after tax, right? And the reason we look at after tax is the tax you pay doesn't come to you, it goes to the government, right? So we just start at income after your taxes are paid, right? So not your CTC, but what actually hits your bank account after the tax due at source, etc. So first step is to figure out your income, right? So here we're considering a household with 2 streams of income. There's the individual's income and there's the wife's income. And in this scenario, each is earning 1.5 lakhs a month. So they're earning in total 3 lakhs a month in after tax income, right? So their CTC would be much higher than that, right? So probably 4.5 lakhs, 4 lakhs, right? So next, we're going to look at the expenses. And the format I recommend for looking at expenses is dividing your expenses into two categories. And we'll discuss why in the next session. But the two categories are fixed expenses and discretionary expenses. And I know these sound a bit intimidating, but look, it's pretty simple. Fixed expenses basically means something which doesn't depend on your day-to-day decision making, right? And that just tends to be recurring and relatively fixed. So this could be, for example, your electricity bill. You don't decide to use electricity today, you just use it, right? And every month you pay your electricity bill, or your rent, right? You signed a lease for your house, and every month you owe that money regardless of what you decide to do from a day-to-day basis, right? Or your vehicle loan payments, or your Uber expenses for going to and from work, right? All those things are relatively fixed, and you can't really change them easily based on your day-to-day decision making. Gym memberships are another example of this, that anything due monthly kind of thing. The next category is your discretionary expenses. So this is all your other expenses. This is, did I decide to eat out today? Did I decide to buy some clothes today, right? Did I decide to watch a movie today? So usually your credit card bills and your cash withdrawals will fall in this bucket, right? So looking at it in these two buckets is going to help us optimize the spending in the next session, right? And as we'll discuss in the next session, these fixed expenses, because they're harder to change, are a very dangerous area that we're going to want to understand carefully over time. And we want to be very careful of adding fixed expenses as you over time. So when we take our income, subtract out the fixed expenses, and subtract out the discretionary expenses, you're left with your savings for the month, right? And you can take that amount and divide by your income to get a sense of how much of the money that went into your bank account stayed in your bank account at the end of the month. That's what we call the savings rate. So this household, for example, saved 1 out of every $3 or rupees that it got in its bank account in this period, right? So a 33% savings rate. And you can see in February, they did a little better. And in March, they did even better, right? And you can see also where they got their reductions over time, how they managed to get their savings rate up. So doing this exercise is what we recommend as a first step to getting your expenses under control. Okay, so the next thing I want to cover is what's a good savings rate, and more importantly, why, right? So you will get lots of rule of thumbs given to you, but what most people fail to explain to the person is why that rule of thumb works. So what we want to do here is not only tell you what the rule of thumb is, but we want to walk you through the math a little bit so you understand why that rule of thumb is the one that people decide to go with, right? So you may have heard it, but the general rule of thumb that people use is your savings should be at least 30% of your after-tax income. Okay, and don't worry if it's not right now. They're talking about over your entire career, or your 30% of your after-tax income. So if you're under saving today, you have plenty of time to fix that over your career. So the goal here is not to say you're good or bad. The goal here is to say, why is this the recommendation, and what can you do to get there over time, right? So let's understand why this rule works. So let's start with this chart here. So if I am saving 30% of my average income every period, that means I'm spending 70% of my average income, correct? So my expenses are roughly 70% of the money I take in. Now, let's say that I worked for 40 years, right? Typical career, let's say 25 to 65, worked for 40 years. So now let's imagine that all I did with this money was I stuck it under my mattress or put it into a very low interest rate savings account that just covered my inflation costs or whatever. So I didn't even invest the money. I just put it into a savings account, let's say, right? Over 40 years, right? I'm saving 30% every period, every year. How much would my savings grow to? So it would be just that 30% times 40, right? Because 40 years, right? So it would be 1200% of my average income, or 1200% divided by 100 is 12, right? So 12 times my average income is the amount I would have saved in my bank account. Now, if I invested this once I had retired, right? I could probably earn 6% pretty comfortably, right? In a long duration FD, or in a stock fund or whatever, I could earn 6% on this money, right? So taking that 12 times 6%, I get to 72% of my average income. Okay. So that's the amount of income I could generate from those savings when I've retired. And if I look at that number, 72%, right, is higher than my average expenses, which was 70% of my average income. So I'm in a scenario where my savings are giving me more money than my expenses. So my expenses are covered and I've reached financial independence, right? So that's why 30% is considered to be a safe goal to aspire to over the life of your career. If you can save 30% of your after tax income over a long period, even if you don't invest it particularly well, you should be positioned to be very comfortable to retire, right? And that's why we use that as a good rule of thumb for people to aim for. Now, the general rule of savings is, because it's such an important piece of your financial health, the higher the better, right? So just because 30% is the rule, don't, you can go to 40%, absolutely do it, right? It's the higher the better in this case. So that's really the rule we use with savings. So great. I think we've covered a lot today, and I think I want to stop here. So I want to just recap what the important points were that we got away from all of this, right? So first, we learned what personal finance is, right? We learned that it's easy to master, but most people oddly do not do it, right? And personal finance's goal is all about positioning you for financial independence. And what is financial independence? It means that you don't need your salary to cover your expenses. Instead, your savings and the income your savings generate by just being in a bank account or being in investments earn enough for you to cover your expenses, right? And there are four pillars that we're going to explore that underpin strong personal finance health: savings, investing, borrowing, and protecting. And we're going to cover all of these in these series, one at a time. So we started learning about the first pillar, savings. And we learned that savings is the raw material that fuels our financial well-being. We learned that tweaking your spending through good budgeting is the best way to improve your savings rate over time in the short run. And we learned why the rule of thumb is 30%, right? And as a result, we have something to aim for. So where are we going from here? What are we going to do in the next class? So in the next class, we're going to spend some time talking about our tips and traps on savings. So let's say your savings rate is not where you want it, right? How are you going to get it up? What are our recommendations and tips, and what are things that we really recommend that people do not do that can result into traps and difficulties with their savings? So after that, in the next class, we're going to move to the next pillar and introduce investing, right? Which is what you do with all those savings that you've done, and how can you invest them safely and earn a good rate of return on your investments, right? So with that, I'm going to just recap a little bit about Barossa Club, and then we'll open it up for Q&A. So thanks everyone for joining us on this session. There are multiple ways you can follow us, right? The easiest way, And cheapest way, it's free, is just to subscribe to our YouTube channel. Anytime we post a video, you will get access to that video, right? So Anita is going to send a link on to our YouTube channel in the chat. Feel free to subscribe to that. Even if you're not a member, our content will be available for you, etc. For people that are seeing value and like what we're doing, we also have a membership option, and the membership option comes with some other benefits. So you get added to our WhatsApp group where we send sometimes other content and send you reminders of when our seminars are going to be held, etc. And you also get access to additional learning content on our website. We also have some very powerful tools that help you make good decisions with regards to mutual funds and other investment options. And we also publish in-depth research reports, which very much follow the same style that we're doing here, which is making complicated things simple and easy to understand. So you also have access to asking us Q&A through email, and we'll respond to your Q&A. One caveat, we only offer general advice at Barossa Club. We don't offer specific advice. So we'll tell you how to think through things and issues that you may be facing, but we won't tell you what to do. We think it's really important that people make their own decisions in finance. We can be guides. We can help you with what questions to ask, but we leave the final conclusions to you, and recommend that if you can use a personal finance advisor that goes into specific advice to help you make those decisions. So that's what we're all about. Feel free to check out our website at barossaclub.com. Great, thanks. And with that, we'll open it up to Q&A.
Okay, so the first question that's come in is, can everyone aspire, can everyone, including a poor person, aspire to save 30% of their income?
Great question. So it becomes incrementally much easier once you cross a certain level of income. And by virtue of being on this call, I'm going to venture that most people here are above that threshold. And the reality is it is much more difficult for someone who's below a certain line to hit a 30% savings rate, because at the end of the day, you can cut back on your expenses only to a certain point, right? I mean, you're still going to need to eat. You're still going to need to put a roof over your head. You're still going to need to get to work, etc. So unfortunately, for people below a certain income level, 30% is just not realistic, right? And that's one of the challenges that we're facing as a economy. That some people, the society we've set up just doesn't enable them to hit that 30% savings rate. So it's a good question, and the answer is no, unfortunately. But I would guess that everybody on this call is well above that level. I think we can all hit a 30% number, and at surprisingly low levels of income. And that's what the Millionaire Next Door book really drives home. So if to the person that asked that question, highly recommend you read that book, and you'll see that your salary is only one input in your personal finance health, and probably not even the most important input. It's an important one, but probably not the most important.
Okay, the US is a very rich country, but many people struggle with achieving financial independence. Why is this?
See, this is a great illustration of that point, right? The US is, as the questioner mentioned, one of the richest countries in the world, and their savings rate is almost zero. People live off their credit cards in the US, and it's because they spend everything they earn, and not only that, they take debt, they borrow to buy things and that they cannot afford, and that's part of the culture there. And it's one of the reasons why the US is very ill prepared for something like what happened recently, because people don't have access to savings nets. Something like COVID comes along and you lose your job. What are you going to do, right? So it's very we should not aspire to be like the US in that characteristic. There are many things that they do well, but their savings rate is a reflection of the fact that just because you earn a lot of money doesn't mean you're financially healthy.
Okay, the next question is, under the Learn section in Barossa, there's another section called save. You talk of repeat expenses and one-off expenses. Will this be covered in the next session?
Yes, it will. We'll talk about that. So fixed expenses is another word for kind of your repeat recurring expenses. We'll probe that more deeply in the next session.
Okay. One question, how does one plan for taking risks in your career, like becoming an entrepreneur for a few years without jeopardizing your savings rate, retirement goals significantly?
Really, really good question. So the best way you can prepare for something like that is to oversave early in your career. If you oversave early in your career, if you're saving 40, 50% early in your career, you've built up a little war chest, right? Of savings that you can use to take more risks like that. If you've been under saving in your career, then it's very hard for you to explore your passions like that. Maybe you want to start your own business, but you don't know if it'll work, etc., right? So the best way you can position yourself to do that is by over saving early, giving yourself financial flexibility to take risks later in life. And that's my advice there.
The next question is, it's a statement actually, over 40 years, you need to factor inflation to reach the 72% level.
So it's a good point. So the assumption, you're absolutely right. Inflation is part of the analysis. So the uh, fundamental assumption that was made was that whatever your savings were invested in, if it was a savings account or whatever, the rate of return on your savings account would offset most of the inflation, right? So the inflationary impact would not have been that large in this case. But yes, technically, to do it purely rigorously, you'd also have to factor in a rate of return on the investment.
Are there any more questions? There's none on the chat, but anyone else has a quick question, please post it on the chat. Otherwise, that's all for this session. I don't see anyone typing.
Okay. We'll give it a few minutes, but in the meantime, thanks everyone for joining. Hope we see you in 2 weeks when we do the next session. Hope you got a lot out of this, and this is going to be fun. We're going to realize that this is surprisingly easy, and hopefully it'll make a big difference to anyone. Any other questions filtered in?
No, there's nothing more coming in. So I think we can wrap up for today.
Okay, great guys. Thank you.